Hi, it's Moser with a quick tutorial on pedigrees, making them and using them. After this video, you should be able to construct a pedigree when you're given a family history, interpret a pedigree and identify genotypes and phenotypes from it. That means you already need to know what genotypes and phenotypes are, as well as how Mendelian and sex-linked traits are passed on to offspring. So, pedigrees, huh? Are we talking dog food? No, of course not. What we're talking are diagrams that look like this, that are used to trace characteristics and traits that are genetic in origin within families. They're very often used to trace diseases, but they can be used to trace a variety of things. Pedigrees are also used when animals are being bred, dogs, cats, cows, horses. An animal's pedigree refers to sort of its ancestry. It's a chart that shows all of its ancestors. We'll start out by becoming acquainted with some of the common symbols used in pedigrees. So, males are shown with squares, and an open square that's not colored in is a male who is not affected by whatever trait is being represented in the pedigree. Females are represented by circles, and an open circle not filled in is an unaffected female. Now, males who are affected by whatever the trait, or females who are affected by whatever the trait is that's being traced, are shown by a square and a circle respectively, but their square or circle is colored in. Now, since pedigrees are generally about tracing genetic traits through a family, of course we're interested in when people reproduce together. This is sometimes called a marriage line. It's really just a mating line because we don't care about legal status. We just want to see who had a baby together. Speaking of babies, there's an offspring. So that line that drops down vertically from a mating line or a marriage line represents a descent line. And the little circle or square that appears below it, well, that's the offspring. Let's start a pedigree with two couples. So this is the first generation we're working with, the oldest generation. We notice that we number our generations at the side using Roman numerals. And we've got two couples. One is a pair, neither of whom are affected by whatever trait we're tracing. And in the other couple, we have a female who is affected. Now, as sometimes happens, the male here is deceased. We're being told this retrospectively, so this might be somebody's grandpa. It doesn't mean he died young. We have no other information than to know that at the point when we are making the pedigree, that individual in that first generation has already died. But each of these couples had some children. So the first couple, the one where the husband is deceased, had 3 children, 1 girl and 2 boys. We typically put the children in order, reading from left to right, just like you read, of who was born first. So it looks like their oldest is a girl, then they had 2 boys. None of them are affected by whatever this condition is that we're tracing. Now, on the other side, they had 4 children, and their oldest was also a girl. Then they had a boy. He was affected by whatever this condition is. Then, well, that's kind of unusual. What does that mean? That doesn't look like everything else. Those are twins. They're not identical. As you can see, their 2 lines come down from the family line independently. I'll show you what identical twins look like a little bit later. Okay, so we've got our 2 families, one with 3 offspring, one with 4 offspring. Now, those 2 partner, marry, mate, whatever, they have a baby, as shown by the fact that they've got a mating line and they have a line of descent. So they have 1 daughter, she's affected by whatever this condition is, and then, for whatever reason, they have 2 more. But wait, those don't look like all the rest either. Notice that those 2 have a dashed line and they have those sort of brackets around them. Those are adopted children. We can show them on a pedigree because there are some conditions that have an environmental component, where there's more to the disease than your genetics. We want to know whose house you grew up in. So, that's sort of the basics of a pedigree. Now let's try building one from a family history. So let's start with a family history and attempt to build a pedigree from that. The little red star indicates the person of interest, the client, however you want to express it. And very often, people want to have a pedigree built when they want to have a baby, and they want to know about some genetic condition in their family. Let's start with the wife or the client's side. So she's an only child, and we know she had parents, and it says that her father is affected and that she has 2 maternal aunts, one of whom is affected. Okay. It also says that the wife's mother is unaffected, but her maternal uncle is deceased. Your maternal uncle is your mom's brother. What about her grandparents? Well, it says that she only has 1 living grandparent, her maternal grandmother, and we don't have any information about whether or not they have siblings or anything else, so we can just leave them as deceased. Okay, easy enough. Now let's go to the husband's side. It says that the husband has 4 younger siblings, 3 girls and 1 boy. So there's his family. Well, we know that they had to have parents, and it says that the mother is affected, but that he has no maternal aunts or uncles. So both of his parents were only children. We have no information on his grandparents other than that his maternal grandfather is deceased. Okay, well, that's all we have. We'll start analyzing the pedigree in just a second. What we have here is an example of a pedigree, and honestly, I stole this off the internets. But whenever we look at a pedigree and we want to start to analyze it, we have to ask ourselves 2 questions. 1, can we tell if this trait is sex-linked or not? And if it's dominant or recessive? And then based on that, what genotypes can we start labeling? So first of all, let's ask about sex-linked or not. What evidence do we have that would tell us whether or not this trait was sex-linked? Well, if we look in the first generation, we see a male and a female affected, here just a male, here males and females, and here males and females. It appears that this condition, whatever it is, and we have no idea, seems to be affecting roughly equal numbers of males and females. We wouldn't expect to see that if this was a sex-linked trait. So we're going to assume that this is not in fact sex-linked. Now the other question, is this trait dominant or recessive? Well, here we have 2 parents, neither of whom have the trait, who produce 2 offspring who do have the trait. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that this trait has to be recessive because these parents must both be carriers for whatever this is, and that allows them to give each offspring a recessive gene, but yet to not be affected themselves. So we figured out that this is a recessive trait. Now, based on that, can we label any genotypes? Well, if we use big N for not affected or normal, and little n for affected with whatever the trait is, this is pretty common, one thing we can do immediately is label all of the affected individuals. If this is a recessive trait, all the affected individuals have the same genotype. Now that we have all the affected individuals labeled, let's see who else we can label. Well, we know a little something about the parents of affected individuals. These folks, because if they're not affected, we know they have at least 1 big N, but we don't know about the contents of the second allele that they possess for this trait. Or do we? Well, where did their offspring get those little N's? Aha, from each parent. So we know that any parents of affected individuals must be carriers. Okay, so we've labeled all the parents who have affected offspring as carriers. Is there anybody else that we can label? Well, I see some individuals we can label. So what if you have an affected parent and a parent who's not a carrier? What would that look like? If you have a parent who's affected, even if your other parent is not a carrier, you are guaranteed to be a carrier because your affected parent could only pass down that recessive allele to you. So all those offspring who have an affected parent must be carriers if they're not affected. Is there anybody else here that we can label? Probably not. We don't know about individual 2 or individual 3. They might be carriers, they might not. We don't know about individuals 3 or 4. We don't know about individuals 6 or 7. Oh, we do know about individual 9. Sure enough, they're going to be a carrier. Why is individual 9 a carrier? That's right. Because of individual 7, their father, who is affected, Therefore, we know he passed on a recessive allele for this condition. We know nothing about individual 11. This person married into the family. We do know their kids are all carriers because of their affected parent. That looks like it's about all we can do. Excellent. Do you feel like you have that? Good. Now let's go on to something a little more tricky. So we have another pedigree. Again, I'll admit I stole it from the internet. But we want it, no matter where I got it, we want to ask ourselves the same two questions. Can we tell if this trait is sex-linked, dominant, or recessive? And based on that, what genotypes can we label? Well, let's look at what we have here. First of all, I see that there's no one affected in the first generation. And then in the second generation, we have a male affected, no females. In the third generation, I have a male affected. And in the fourth generation, I have a male affected. While it's possible that this condition might not be sex-linked, it seems awfully unlikely that a condition would only affect males in 4 generations and not be sex-linked. So let's go ahead and proceed assuming that it is in fact sex-linked, and let's try labeling some genotypes. If we can make sense of it in that context, then we'll have to assume that we're correct and it is sex-linked. So we'll go ahead and use X big N and X little n for our alleles on the X chromosome. And of course we also have a Y chromosome, which doesn't carry a gene for this condition, assuming that we are correct and it is in fact sex-linked. So if it's sex-linked, who can we immediately label genotypes for? Well, I'd start with unaffected males. They'd be X big N Y. What about those affected males? Well, we also know their genotype. There's only one option for them. They're X little n Y. Okay, we've got the guys. They're pretty easy. Now, are there any females for whom we can be absolutely certain we know their genotypes? As a matter of fact, there are. So let's look at this guy, individual 5 in the 3rd generation. Where did he get that funky X chromosome? Well, he got his Y from his papa, or he wouldn't be a boy. He got his X from his mom, which means whatever this sex-linked condition is, his mom has to be a carrier. I've done the females in green just because it felt like things were getting a little bit too crowded. So we know that individual 5 in the 2nd generation is a female carrier. We know that individual 2 in the 1st generation is a female carrier. Where are our other female carriers? Well, individual 2 in the 3rd generation would have to be a female carrier since she had a male offspring who has the condition. We can't know anything about individual 4 in that generation. We can't know anything about individual 6 in that generation. And we know nothing about individual 2 in that generation. We know that in any case where a female has a mother who's a carrier, they have a 50% chance of carrying the trait themselves. We want to prove that through a Punnett square. In this case, since we're only talking about the daughters, we don't need to worry about the X's. But you can see in this Punnett square that any female offspring of a carrier mother has a 50% chance of being a carrier herself. We don't know. Could be, might not be. It's a fool's errand to try to guess. That's it. Do you feel like you're able to construct a pedigree when you're given a family history? And do you feel like you can interpret a pedigree and identify genotypes and phenotypes from it? Good. Go practice.